So now let's move on to talking about the actual print process. So how is this stuff going to work? Because once you actually know what you're doing and you have, a way of producing good quality CMYK, you understand your flat blacks and your ridge blacks, you know how to pick color textures, you know all this stuff, there's still some minutia that you want to be aware of that it just saves you time if you know this stuff up front, right? There's mistakes, or not even mistakes really, but just like things that we could have just pre-planned for that we just had no idea, because until you go through the process, you don't know. So the first one already actually came up in the chat when someone was trying to estimate what the pound of the paper was. But basically, let me walk you through how this printing process is actually going to work, because then you can start to see why there are these subtleties involved in it. So if you imagine you are the printer, what are you actually doing? Well, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to make actual physical plates, right, that have the images on them for where the ink gets deposited for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, right? These are actual physical things. So you're going to have to make actual physical things for depositing ink. Why do you have to do this? Well, if you use a process like an inkjet process where you actually just have like a moving like print head or something like that, like the way that like a normal printer works, like a household printer or an office printer, there's no way you're going to get the volume up. The time it would take even a fast one of those going back and forth to print, forget it, right? There's no way you're turning out enough press material to print, 10,000 copies of some book, right, at that rate. So what they need to be able to do is they need to be able to do a process for a graphic novel that's a lot like, a scaled down version of how you print like the New York Times, right? You need those big rolling drums that the paper just like goes through and gets ink slapped down on it, right? Now, it doesn't have to be the New York Times because you're not printing millions of these things, but you need something like that. So they're going to have to take the files that you give them and they're going to have to make some physical elements that will actually deposit that ink down. It's a lot of setup cost. And they call these plates, even though they're not necessarily plate shaped anymore, because they might be going through like a rolling thing. But then they're going to have to mount these into a press, and they're going to have to put paper through the press. Now, in the case of the New York Times, it's actually like a roll of paper. Like the paper is like spooled off of giant rolls, and it rams through the machine in like this one continuous process. That's probably not how a graphic novel is going to be printed, because that's usually for printing like super duper high volume. So if it's a graphic novel, it's probably being printed on cut sheets. But those cut sheets are still going through roughly the same process. They're large, much larger than the book, and they're getting fed through some kind of an element that's like stamping out inks one at a time. Cyan first, magenta, yellow, black, let's say, or who knows what order they go in, only your printer knows. And you're probably going to do these on both sides of the paper at the same time. So you don't have to like take it out the other end and flip it over and then put it through, right? So most modern presses, I think, the typical one would actually print on two sides at once. So you're going to mount those two elements, you're going to feed through a sheet, and that sheet is going to want to contain more than one page because it's huge, right? You don't want to put one little piece on there, right? So your printer is going to have to lay out all of these pages onto a larger page. So they're going to put like 16 pages at a time tiled across like a page. They're going to feed that through the press. And when they get all the pages out on the other end, they're going to cut them, right? So this is where we get into some prepress concerns that we didn't talk about that are relevant to this fact that, okay, now that we're not just talking about just how the ink's going to come out, we have to start talking about like the shape and size of a page because it matters. Okay. So the first thing is, because the printer has to fit multiple pages onto a single sheet that runs through the press, and then they have to cut it apart to bind it into an actual book, it means that you have to prepare for having some bleed around the edge of the actual artwork, right? So what does this mean? Well, if we take a look, for example, at one of the, in fact, I actually happen to accidentally pick one right here, so I don't actually have to go to the book for this, but suppose we bring up this particular plate that we talked about before, and we look at what the actual graphic looks like for this page, okay? This image extends all the way to the edge. Down here, it doesn't really matter because it's just some flat black throughout, right? But up here, well, not really. Like, it kind of all just goes all the way out to the end. So what's going to happen when this page gets printed onto a giant sheet with lots of other pages, and then it has to get cut, is some amount of variation. Just like the inks can't be perfectly lined up, there's going to be some minor little amount of variability potentially, and again, depending on how good the press is, it could be more or less accurate, in how razor sharp that cut is, right? So they're never going to put two pages right next to each other. There's got to be a gap in between the two. And that gap is generally called the bleed. It's called the bleed or the cropping region. And so when you actually make an image like this, and we knew this ahead of time because we had some experience. So when we started making Meow the Infinite way back when Anna before she even drew the first one, we knew there had to be some bleed. We artificially padded all of the frames with 1/8 of an inch around the entire outside, knowing that that way there was plenty of room for cropping it without ruining it, right? So our page size that we tell the printer is actually smaller than this page size, and it gets cropped out. So when this actually appears printed, it will be 1/8 of an inch shrunk all the way around, because that's the actual page size. But we added that bleed so that when the printer's printing it, and then they have to cut it, it doesn't matter how accurate they are. It will be a good looking page either way. There won't be like a little bit of a replication distortion or garbage there, right? Because normally what a printer will do if you hand them stuff that doesn't have a crop region is they'll just have to duplicate what the pixels are on the edge, and then you'll get a little bit of a bend in that line, right? Because as it gets duplicated out, instead of it continuing, right? Everything should continue, but instead it would just get duplicated. You know what I'm saying? So that's a prepress concern that you probably want to plan for, having a 1/8 border or something like that, 1/8 of an inch border all the way around. And again, that's just there so the printer has enough to work with. And then when they do their layout, they know how much tolerance they need. It might not be 1/8 of an inch. So they may only need a 1/16 of an inch or a 32nd of an inch, who knows. But at least they now have as much as they need, and they can pick the size they actually want to print, and then they'll cut it down to the correct size, knowing that even if they're off a little bit, it doesn't matter. They're still going to get a great looking page out of it. So that's the first thing that you can kind of intuit from that printing process. The fact that the pages aren't actually going through as individual little sheets that match the book size. They're actually all printed on very large sheets that then get cut down. Okay, so the second implication that has for not so much a pre-press process as much as just your decision-making process is here's where you can reason about the age-old question that nobody seems to have an answer for, and there's a reason for this, as you'll see in a second, which is how big should the page be? What should the page size be, right? And there is no answer to this question, and let me sort of give some elaboration as to why. The first reason that there's no answer to how big the pages should be in a graphic novel is because, look, we're printing it on a giant sheet of paper. It doesn't matter what size you pick, because no matter what size you pick, it's not going to be that big. Nobody could read a graphic novel. So unless you're doing an art installation piece, you're never going to print a graphic novel page that's going to be as big as one of the actual source sheets of paper. So no matter what size you pick, they're going to be able to put it on that page and print it, cut it, and bind it. So you can pick whatever size you want, right? So that's one fairly reassuring answer. There's really no way to completely screw up picking the size. But that said, there are some concerns. If you want to really minimize the total cost of printing and you're like a super duper optimization head, it's possible that you might actually want to think about the effects that the page size versus the paper size has on your actual costs. And here they are. The larger a page is, the more ink it takes to print, period. Because the same image on a wider page takes more ink, right? There's just more coverage. So that drives up your per book cost. If there is wasted space on the page, so when you're tiling these images to fit onto one sheet of paper, if there's wasted space there because you can't fit much of another page, there's like half a whole page missing on this side or something, that drives up your paper cost, right? So your per unit cost goes up. So you want to try and pick a size that will nicely tile perfectly or close to perfectly one sheet, but will not have pages that are overly large so they don't use too much ink, right? If only it were that simple. After that, you'd now have to take into account that when you actually cut and bind all these books, they're going to go into pallets and boxes. Those boxes may be specific sizes, and if you can only fit certain numbers of books in a box, that may change your storage and shipping costs. And if there's warehousing involved, that warehouse may have size constraints that would affect your page size decision, right? So if you really, really, really want to get down the nitty-gritty, those are all the parameters that you might need to be thinking about, right? So it's a little bit complicated. We just were like, all right, we're going to pick a size we like. We know we can't go too wrong with something that's in like the 6-inch by 9-inch range, so we're going to be like roughly around there. And we just kind of looked at graphic novels we liked and, went with one that we thought would feel good. That's how we did it. But you can get more hardcore on that. If you want to, you could go nuts. Also, if you plan on working with a publisher, that publisher may have standard sizes that they already prefer for their logistics supply chain. So you could always ask them. But most people who are starting a comic don't have a publisher. So it really doesn't help you because no two publishers necessarily have the exact same thing in mind for how they want their whole process to work, right? So it's tricky. That's all I can say. So, excuse me. That print process does have one relatively hard constraint on how you lay out your book. And that is the number of pages in the book can't really be arbitrary. I mean, it can, but you will incur all kinds of additional costs from your printer if you truly want the number of pages in your book to be arbitrary. As a simple example, if Meow the Infinite were 208 pages, it would be $80 cheaper than if it were 200 pages. And that's just literally the actual pricing from our printer. So I was going to say that again. If Meow the Infinite were 208 pages long, it would be $80 cheaper to print than if it were 200 pages long. Why is this? Well, the reason is because the printer's print process has a number of actual physical steps involved that work in specific multiples. And if you were trying to do something that breaks those multiples, it may end up costing you more even though you're doing less. So in this case, our printer is set up to print on 16s for our page size and our paper stock and all those things. I don't inquire too deeply about their processes, so I don't actually know exactly when the 16 rule applies. It may only apply to certain types of bindings, certain types of paper stock, who knows, right? Or certain tilings of that page. In order to do a print process that wasn't a multiple of 16, you needed to add a special step in the process that just cost more money. So you would never really do it unless you literally couldn't think of anything to do with those 8 extra pages. So again, be aware this is a physical process. There are physical limitations to the process. There are physical labor costs. There are specific material costs. And there are certain machinings that will all imply constraints on the process. In so much as you can, find a printer to work with and ask them all these questions as often and as early as you can, because the more information you have about the actual print process you will be using, the more you can do to make sure your book doesn't hit any bad cost elements that you wish you wouldn't have to pay, right?